We have such a fantastic guest. We're so excited to have him here. It's Dr. Carl Hart, and I'll give you a little bit of information about Dr. Hart. He is the associate professor in departments of psychology and psychiatry at Columbia University. He's also the first tenured African-American professor of sciences at Columbia, and he is the author of this book, High Price, A Neuroscientist's Journey of Self-Discovery That Challenges Everything You Know About Drugs and Society. Dr. Hart, thanks so much for coming on The Young Turks. Appreciate you coming.
Thank you for having me.
And this is, I love this book. I'm about halfway through it. I didn't realize I had to be here to interview you until late in the day, so I raced through as much of it as I could. And it's really fascinating. I'm enjoying it, and I can't wait to finish it. But part of why I like it so much is there's truth in what you say in the title about the challenges everything you know about drugs and society, because it's one of these books that you read it and you say, wow, my thinking about all of these things is totally wrong-headed, and it's informed by propaganda and misinformation, and I need to rethink my approaches and my attitude about these things. So thank you for that.
I just wish everybody else has the same reaction that you have.
Is that hasn't been the case necessarily?
Well, you know, when people learn things, whether it's wrong or incorrect or right, it's difficult to get people to change what they think about something that they worked so hard to learn some piece of information, and now you come along and you tell them that was wrong.
Yeah.
And so that's kind of difficult, people. So I just wish they had the same attitude as you.
Well, this is the Young Turks. We sort of swim against the tide already anyway. So, but I'd like to start because with talking about your background, because you have, as we said, you're the first African-American or tenured African-American professor of sciences at Columbia, and your path has been an unusual one, where you began and how you got there. So if you could give us a little background about where you grew up and what the path that led you to where you are today a little bit.
Yeah, so that's one of the major questions that everybody asks,
Yes.
like how did you get from point A being growing up in the hood, life of poverty, sold drugs, petty crimes, and that sort of thing.
Actually, I was talking about, because we're in LA, I was talking about how you got here, which freeway you took. That's all anybody cares about in LA.
Well, I wouldn't have got here if it was up to me, so you have to thank Lynn for that. But, so how do you go from point A, the hood, until the Ivory Tower, or Ebony Tower now that I'm there?
A shade darker, maybe. Yeah, it's still pretty ivory.
Yeah, how do you get there? So I think one of the most important things for me that helped me to stay, or actually helped me in this trajectory, is that I was really big into sports. As you and I were talking earlier, I played high school basketball throughout. And in order to play high school basketball, I had to maintain a certain GPA, high standards. I think it was something like a 2.0 or something like that.
Right.
I barely met it, but I met those high standards. And so that ensured that I would graduate from high school. Mm-hmm. And otherwise, I wouldn't have graduated from high school because there would be no real reason to stay in school for me.
And this was in Miami or in Fort Lauderdale?
This was in Miami, Miramar, that area, South Florida area. So that helped keep me plugged in school, and I graduated. I also had 5 sisters, all of them older than me, and they were surrogate mothers for the most part. I had a strong grandmother, that helped. Mm-hmm. I had a guidance counselor who, when I didn't get a basketball scholarship, asked me to speak with some military recruiters. As a result, I decided to go into the Air Force. We also had aid to families with dependent children, AFDC, welfare as we once knew it before Clinton.
Welfare.
Right, yeah, exactly. That program helped us in the summertime. Not only did it help us with food and housing allowance, but it helped in the summertime such that we had summer jobs for kids like me in our sort of situation. Those things are no longer there.
Yeah. But it created a culture of dependency where if you hadn't had welfare, who knows, maybe you wouldn't be at Columbia, maybe you'd be at a better university than Columbia. You only had to settle for Columbia.
Yeah, that's right. If you have that logic, you probably shouldn't be talking to the public. But of course, we do have people who talk to the public with that logic. But the point is that there were a lot of safety nets for people like me, and my sisters and I, and also my brothers, we are all tax-paying citizens. We are all contributing to the tax base now. And so it just goes to show that those programs certainly were successful for the majority of us, although we tend to focus on some minority groups but they were successful for the majority of us. So all of that helped to ensure that I go to the Air Force. I went to the Air Force because I didn't get a college scholarship. Now, in the Air Force, all of my time was spent overseas. I spent nearly 3 years over in England. And in England, I got quite an education. Not only a formal education, I went to college in England, but I also got an informal education about the United States.
Right.
In
you
England,
can become an observer from the outside by stepping out. You can be much more.
Absolutely.
Become, yeah.
Absolutely. I mean, you're an outside observer, but there was also a critique by the British people. Like the BBC, they ran programs like the Eyes on the Prize, the PBS program, the Eyes on the Prize, about the U.S. Civil Rights Movement and about how race plays out in the United States. And so I was learning about race, things I already knew, not intuitively, but I had experienced.
But you hadn't analyzed.
I hadn't analyzed it, and now I have some other sort of country corroborating my reality outside of the United States. So I had to go outside of the United States to get official corroboration for my experience, and that was really helpful. And that helped me think more critical. And so coming back to the United States after my time in the military, I finished my undergraduate studies, got a number of mentors who encouraged me to go on to graduate school because they thought I had something that was worthwhile, worth investing in, and they invested in me. So I went to the University of Wyoming, one of the whitest states in the Union, but I went there, got a solid education in neuroscience, really started to think critically about not only neuroscience, but also society. My thinking got better. So I studied the brain and drugs in the brain of rats for about 7 or 8 years. And after that, I went on and did a postdoc several postdocs in which I studied drugs in humans. And then I got a faculty position at Columbia, continued my studies of drugs, and of course I had many mentors along the way. Those mentors were critical, and that helped me to move along. So that's part of my sort of memoir portion of the book.
I mean, there's a lot more that I recommend you read the book. I mean, you were a DJ and you DJed with Run DMC, and it talks about your basketball experience and also your football experience and how you're a top flight athlete, and it's just fascinating stuff. But what's interesting, you mentioned the sports in the beginning, is that a lot of people in the lower class, working and poor, view, especially African American community, view sports as a potential way out.
Yeah.
And it's sort of a 1 in a million shot in many ways. But in your case, it didn't result in a professional sports career, but it helped keep you focused and, to a degree, out of trouble. Not entirely, as you'll read if you read the book. But that's a sort of an interesting. We usually think, it's a 1 in a million shot, you shouldn't bother. Yeah. But there's intrinsic value that doesn't have anything to do with necessarily potentially making money playing sports later on.
Sure, athletics, man, it has a number of things that we value in the workplace. We value in college. We value in many spaces. Competitiveness, you learn how to be competitive. You learn how to work as a team. You learn how to work towards a goal. You learn how to be focused, all kinds of things. So athletics are an excellent way to shape these behaviors that we value in this society. So if people think that athletics might not be the way to go, it's really short-sighted. It's athletics along with a number of other things that we expect from young people, that not only athletics, but these other things as well.
So, and one of the things you also talk about in the book is how you bought into much of the propaganda or the mythology around drugs, the anti-drug campaigns. You saw what happened in your community when the so-called crack epidemic occurred and became the latest hysteria back in the 80s. But you believed it, but you don't today. What about your experience made you buy into that at the time?
Well, as you recall, in the 1980s, even before crack, drugs have always been around in society,
but hard to get sometimes. I'm sorry.
Depends on what neighborhood.
Feeling perhaps a bit too much.
Depends on where you're at. You're right. They are actually kind of difficult to get, but there are people who. Well, let's move on.
We'll talk later after the show.
We'll talk about that later. The point is that I bought in.
Yeah.
I bought in part because drugs have always been in our society. People have always used drugs. And also problems have always been in society. But in the 80s, even before the 80s, the 70s and so forth, whenever there are really difficult problems, drugs are excellent scapegoats to blame for the problem. And that certainly happened when I was growing up. If you see somebody doing poorly and they use drugs or whatever, you can just say, oh, drugs. And everybody will say, oh, yeah. Without critically thinking about it, drugs are the problem. So I was no different. I was just as stupid, inability to think, and so I bought right in. It seemed like it. I had never done cocaine. I had never freebased. That was one of the big things there. So it must be that. It couldn't be these other things, because otherwise I would have experienced the problems. And so I thought that was the problem.
And it's not just the larger society and white middle class America. Sure. That the African American community bought into it. Earlier today we had a gentleman on the show who grew up in South LA, and he was saying that in the 80s crack destroyed his community the way Hurricane Katrina destroyed New Orleans. And I was thinking, I'd just been reading your book, and I was like, well, maybe there are other factors in that crack just sort of, there was a hole and crack moved into that hole or whatever. And so what you're saying is radical to a lot of people. And I don't mean that in the sense that it's crazy. I just mean that a lot of people can never get their head around the idea that crack is not this horrible, destructive presence in our inner cities, and how can you say that it's not addictive and that it's not the cause of problems? Because don't you see what's right in front of your eyes?
Well, let's go back to this notion that crack is so harmful.
Right.
Now, the first thing we want to make sure we make clear for the simple-minded people is that nobody is saying.
This is good you're telling me, because I'm one of them.
The first thing we want to make clear is that no one is saying that crack, cocaine, or any other psychoactive drug doesn't have potentially powerfully negative effects. That's a fact.
Right.
But we'll talk later about some of the ways to mitigate or attenuate those effects. So that's a fact. The problem is that people stop looking once they think that they have the answer with crack. So when you look at the evidence, if you say, well, let's look at the majority of the people who use crack cocaine. 80, 90% of those people go on and not have a problem. They pay taxes, they work, they do all of these things. So now when you see that, and you see only a smaller percentage of people who have problems with crack, that tells you that it's beyond the pharmacology of that drug. That's one thing.
But we focus as a society on that 10% or whatever it is who have the problem, and that's what we fixate on.
Sure. And not only that, we focus on our moments in time. For example, during the crack era, if you will, people said crack was responsible for grandmothers raising a whole new generation of children. These mothers have let their children be raised by their grandmothers because they're out in the street using crack, whatever. Now, my mother didn't raise all of us. In fact, she went away for more than 2 years. Other people in the neighborhood were raised by their grandmothers like I was at some period in my life. This is long before crack. And this happened before crack, and it happened after crack. It happened in the black community. This happened in, all of these kind of pathologies happened in the Jewish communities when the Eastern European Jews came over to New York at the turn of the century. And this has been documented in Urban Howell's book, World of Our Fathers, quite clearly. And so if you look at a number of groups, you see all of these sort of pathologies happening before crack or crack isn't involved, but oftentimes drugs and alcohol are the scapegoats.
Right.
Because they are easy, and they're easy to scapegoat because now you don't have to look at the more complicated problems.
Systemic problems.
Yeah, they're more complicated, and politicians are certainly comfortable not looking at those more difficult problems because they want to offer a solution to the population that they got it and they're going to fix it with a new law. That's all they can really offer is a new law. And so a new law to go out the crack, you solve the problem. You actually don't, but people think that you do, right?
But don't politicians also, aren't they interested in appearing to have solutions, but they don't want to make systemic change because this is a system that they've been successful in. And so if they are going to propose solutions that will change that system, that they are potentially, but that's a different
yeah, you're asking me to get into the mind of simple-minded people, and I don't know how to do that, quite frankly.
That's more my area.
Right.
So let's talk about your research then. So how did you develop an interest in looking into these things? Because one of the things you talk about in the book, if I recall, is that by buying into the propaganda and seeing the devastation wrought in your community by crack, so you thought, I'm going to go and research the brain and figure out how to solve the problem of addiction so that it won't, we can get these people, or end this problem in our communities. What you found was something different.
Yeah, so shifting gears. So we talked a little bit about the memoir portion of the book. Now let's talk a little bit about the science part, the research part. So I started, as you pointed out, trying to figure out this brain area called the nucleus accumbens. We tend to think of it as a pleasure area of the brain. So I was determined to find out why people in my community were addicted to drugs. And so I did this in laboratory animals and trying to search for it. But then I discovered that I didn't know anything about human drug abuse, so I wanted to study humans, so I started studying humans. Now, in my study of animals and humans, it's been 20-some years now, 22 years, I've learned some critical points, critical information. One, the vast majority of people who use drugs like crack cocaine, heroin, methamphetamine, the marijuana, the works, the vast majority of those people are not addicted. They use the drugs in a similar way that our last 3 presidents have used them. President Obama has used cocaine, smoked marijuana. President Bush smoked marijuana, widely suspected of having done cocaine.
Yeah.
And Bill Clinton also smoked marijuana, right? So most of the people use the drugs in that fashion, the vast majority.
They are more representative of the majority of people than the crackhead. So
they are more representative of illicit or illegal drug users.
Right.
That was a revelation to me. I didn't know that. I thought everyone who used these drugs had a problem with them. They were addicted. So, wow, didn't know that. Given that's one revelation for me. 2, in my undergraduate education, one of the things that I learned was that if you give an animal, a rat, for example, a primate, a monkey, an opportunity to self-administer cocaine or methamphetamine or these drugs, they will do so until they kill themselves. That was indication that these drugs were so powerfully dangerous.
And we've all heard that about the rat that keeps hitting the lever to deliver it over and over and over again.
Absolutely. So as I looked more carefully, one thing that I learned was that if you provide that animal with alternatives, like a sexually receptive mate, like sweet water, or other food treats, you can disrupt the cocaine taking, the methamphetamine taking. So they don't kill themselves, they choose these other options. So I thought we should try something like that in the laboratory. People had done it, similar things before. In my studies, we found that when you bring crack cocaine smokers into the laboratory, give them a choice to take cocaine or money or merchandise vouchers, whatever.
Like the Wheel of Fortune.
whatever,
Prizes or,
some attractive alternative. What you find is that they will take these attractive alternatives. So they weren't driven only by another hit of cocaine, as I once thought. That was another revelation to me. And another one was that I was also told that methamphetamine, we're in California here, people in California get crazy about methamphetamine. And I'm not talking about the users, I'm talking about the general population and their beliefs.
Right.
Another sort of thing that I learned was that methamphetamine addicts, if you will, or users, long-term users, are cognitively impaired. They have these brain alterations that show why they behave in aberrant fashion.
Right.
I did a review, and I published it last year in the journal Neuropsychopharmacology, a major review of the literature, what people had written and said and what the data says. My conclusion was that researchers, scientists, have overstated the findings with methamphetamine, such that the notion that methamphetamine users are cognitively impaired or brain damaged is just not supported by the weight of the literature. So when I think about those things that I just delineated, the fact that most of the users of these drugs are not addicted, the fact that you can decrease cocaine taking behavior, crack cocaine taking behavior, the fact that these guys are not cognitively impaired, all of these things just fly in the face of conventional wisdom. But more importantly, these things drive public policy.
Right.
And that's the thing that disturbed me most, because sometimes people say, well, why not just exaggerate it, the effects of drugs, so the kids can stay off of the drug? You know, if it was a neutral
It's
thing.
worked so far really
Yeah, yeah.
well, as far as I can tell. I mean,
Well,
you know.
Yeah, I mean, you're being sarcastic, but- right? Some viewers might not know that, but like you say, there's 20 million Americans who use drugs, illegal drugs, on a regular basis. So it hasn't worked as well. But that's okay, because we know humans have used drugs since we've been on this planet, and we will continue to use drugs, and that's just a fact. So one of my things as an educator is that, how do we enhance safety? How do we enhance safety of people who are using drugs? How do we have better public policy that's based on empirical evidence rather than anecdotes? How do we become more efficient as a society? And that's what I'm trying to do. And so I'm trying to get the society to rethink drug policy, because what we're currently doing is not neutral. It's not neutral in that it's causing a lot of harm to specific communities.
I wanted to go back, because one thing I found really interesting about your book that you mentioned is with the studies, something I hadn't thought about, is that when you do studies with rats or with chimpanzees or what have you, they're usually individual rats that they keep in a cage, and then you take out, do your whatever, go through the maze or the chimpanzee, and rats and chimpanzees and most mammals are social creatures. And so if you isolate them, you are not going to get results that represent what, the broader community, what you're going to get from a larger base. I mean, that, my science.
It's perfect.
But understand, so that those rats that are exposed to the cocaine, who keep hitting it to get the reward over and over again, they have nothing else. They have an emptiness in them, and that's all they have to fill that emptiness. And that has a broader application to drug use, but we shouldn't be basing policy on those rats. We should be basing policy on what you're talking about, where you have these rats that have sexual partners, that have a community that they interact with, and what the research shows with them.
Yeah.
But of course we don't, because, I don't want to get into the politics yet, because I still want to talk about your research a little bit more.
Sure.
And so, when did you? Did you have any sort of tipping points in your own mind, or revelations, like where you said, "Oh my God, this is all wrong," and like, as a researcher, you know that when you're going against the grain, you're going to catch heat potentially from the people who are invested in the. When you go and say all these studies are wrong, it's not like everyone is going to embrace you necessarily.
Well, remember, I'm black, and so people don't in this country necessarily embrace me.
Right.
And
you're used to it. You're already.
This is the life that I live, and so I wasn't so worried about the researchers embracing me. I was more worried about what the data said. If I could unequivocally demonstrate that the data show a certain perspective that I have, I really don't care what other people think. Otherwise, I'm not a scientist, and I would lose a popularity contest. I always lose popularity contests.
Sorry.
Yeah, that's not my goal. That's not my goal. That's never been my goal. So, but you do raise an important point, because I sit on a number of committees, national committees with other scientists. And when we think about the war on drugs, we oftentimes think about how police have benefited. We don't think about how scientists have benefited from the war on drugs. And as long as we continue to say how horrible these things are, it also helps scientists' budgets increase as well, because we have to discover or determine why these things are so awful and solve the problem with some new treatment or something like that. Not to say that we shouldn't be looking for new treatments, because we should help people who are having problems. But it's in our interest to exaggerate the extent of harmful effects with drugs. Just give you an example, the National Institute on Drug Abuse funds 90% of all research in this area. that and their mission, their focus is on the pathological effects of drugs, to bring the nation's resources to better understand the pathological effects of drugs. That's a fine mission, and that's an appropriate mission for a National Institutes of Health division to focus on. The problem is that you have a skewed perspective when it funds 90% of the research in this area.
Right.
And so you can see how scientists also have a stake in the drug hysteria game.
Mm-hmm. And the addiction industry is enormous as well.
That's right.
And I'd like to ask you what you think of the current status of addiction medicine and the current approaches to dealing with addiction, because what you're saying is that we have this misguided notion about drugs and drug use and drug abuse and addiction in general. Are we going about treating people in the wrong way? And how do you feel about the way it is
think
now?
of it this way. When you say addiction medicine, also like me, I started out as an addiction expert. I was trying to understand addiction, drug addiction. So think of it in terms of this analogy. If I have a hammer, that's the only tool I have, everything looks like a nail to me. Mm-hmm. That's how we see it in addiction, in that it must be the drug because I'm an expert in drugs. When in fact, it's all of these complicated social issues and social problems that addiction experts have limited or no skills to deal with.
Right.
So when you think about it, they're not really qualified to deal with this problem. But we have a hammer, and so it must be a nail.
And you talk about the way that we as a society approach addiction, and where this is everything's a nail, and we're hammers. So when you want to fly in the face of that and get people to change their minds about that, it seems like a substantial task you're undertaking here, and you're going to get blowback from all of these communities that have a vested interest in it. And it's not just, the scientists, as you point out, but and law enforcement you alluded to, that the drug war is fantastically profitable for very powerful interests, gun manufacturers, and then politicians who are funded by all these people. You are asking, you've got a lot of powerful interests who are going to dispute you and want to perpetuate the propaganda. And the other thing is that you say that the real issue is not addiction, it's poverty. Like poverty is the core of this, and dealing with poverty is something that we've been struggling with as a society for many, many, many years, and it seems like a lot of people think it's just, there's nothing, you can't do anything about it, and it's just going to be, that's just part of living in a capitalist society. And so you're asking, it's not just asking people to change their minds about drug addiction, it's asking people, and drugs, but it's asking people to change their mind about capitalism and American society and who we are and who we think we are, and it's a big piece of cheese you're trying to break off here.
I'm glad you are thinking about it in terms of this larger sort of issue, but really I'm not doing that. What I'm asking people to do is that we make sure that our beliefs have foundations in evidence. That's what I'm asking folks to do. If we do that, we can apply that sort of principles or that sort of behavior to a wide range of issues. That's one thing. But you raised this issue, you raised a number of issues in your statements here. You raised the issue about law enforcement and their stake in this sort of thing. I wrote the book to help the public to understand what skills law enforcement actually have to deal with drugs. First of all, law enforcement has no business speaking on public policy about drugs. They have no training in pharmacology. They have no training in behavioral sciences. But yet, our Office of National Drug Control Policy, every administration is headed up by a law enforcement type. That is ridiculous. And I'm asking the country to say, okay, let's make sure we have people who are qualified to be in those positions. That's one. Mm-hmm. Let's have people who are qualified to have influence on public policy in this area. So that means that law enforcement have no training in pharmacology, no training in behavioral science. They're out. They shouldn't be involved in this process because all they bring is anecdotal information. And shit, I can tell stories with the best of them. There are a number of good storytellers, but they're not included at the table. They can tell better stories than law enforcement.
We'll talk about hammer and nail. I mean, you're law enforcement.
No, absolutely, absolutely. So when we think about all of these sort of interests in terms of the war on drugs, people who have this vested interest, I'm thinking when I wrote the book for the public, so the public now can ask the tough questions of their lawmakers, of the police officer who stands up and say these horrible things about drugs with no support any other than some anecdote. So if people read the book, they'll know how to ask the right questions. And if we have people asking the right question, I think I've done my job as an author, as a scientist. You know, the US taxpayers have supported my career in terms of fellowships and those sorts of things that I've won. And this is my way of giving back, helping them to ask the right questions. Ask the right questions of me, of everyone.
Well, then, if you've been critical in your book of the campaigns, the anti-drug campaigns of the past, the just say no and this is your brain on drugs and all that sort of nonsense. And one of the things you talk about is that when you lie to people about the effects of drugs, and then they have their own personal experience, they look around the people they know or their own personal experience, that's not my brain on drugs. My brain on drugs is actually having a good time, and then I came back and I went about my business. And so the impact of that is for people to no longer believe what they're being told, and that's the people who are the targets because of the drug users themselves. But the people who do buy into it are the ones who don't use, and they're the majority, or they're the ones who are helping to drive public policy. So we'd be better off having no anti-drug campaigns, in my opinion, than the horrible ones we've had in the past. You are an advocate for decriminalization or for legalization. I'm not sure where you stand in the two, but
I am here, so you can ask me. Right?
But I'd like to know what you think, and then concomitant with that, what would your idea of an anti-drug, an effective or a much better anti-drug approach would be? Or shouldn't we bother? Should we just leave people alone and let them do what they want? And
first of all, I wouldn't be stupid enough to call it an anti-drug program. That's ridiculous when we know that humans have used drugs since they've been here and they will continue to. Right. So it wouldn't be called an anti-drug campaign. It would be called drug education. And they would be comprised of real education. We can go down to drugs. We're in California, they're crazy about methamphetamine. Let's take methamphetamine. What does a drug education program looks like?
It's not like it's our mascot or anything, just so you know, but yeah.
Yeah, I tell you, when I come to California, man, it's frightening.
Really? The hysteria?
The hysteria surrounding methamphetamine, it drives me crazy. I mean, in fact, I love California, but the hysteria is so crazy that I don't like to come to California because it's like, what? Well, it reminds me of the East Coast back in the 80s with crack cocaine, how people behave around methamphetamine. So let's just take that drug, for example. What would it look like, drug education? We know a lot about methamphetamine. I've done a number of studies with methamphetamine. We know that methamphetamine is really good at increasing cardiac load or increasing your cardiac activity, heart rate, blood pressure, that sort of thing. Educational campaigns would look like this. If you have cardiac issues, probably shouldn't use this drug, particularly in large doses, because you will put yourself at risk for the #1 killer in the United States, heart disease. So the campaign will be focused on that. The campaign will also be focused on the fact that methamphetamine is really good at keeping people awake. And so
that's true.
Without sleep, if you have chronic sleep loss, associated with all kinds of health problems, various cancers, psychosis, other psychiatric illnesses. So you would encourage people to get sleep and not to use the drug near bedtime. Important. So that drug, you will focus on those sorts of things.
So you would basically tell people the truth about exactly what these drugs do, what the actual potential harms are, very specific harms, not just general fried eggs.
That's right, not the general stuff and not the lies that people have been told about meth mouth and the rest of these things. It would be in a way to enhance the safety. I mean, we don't want to encourage people to use drugs, or illegal drugs, but if you do, at least we know that you have good information, or there are people out there with good information to keep folks safe.
It seems like this really mirrors the sex education abstinence sort of, dichotomy in this country, how one side is pushing for abstinence-only education, and that's the say no to drugs people, and then you have the people who are promoting
That's right.
sex education is based on actual information, and those are people who are talking about what you're talking about, and it seems like it's the same people promoting the same things.
Exactly. So when you think about driving in the same way, in similar ways, it's potentially dangerous activity, but we enhance the safety by making sure that people have driver's ed courses, they have a number of sort of educational opportunities to learn how to enhance safety. Because people in California, man, the highways are maddening, the way people drive out here.
You know,
but
you got a lot of prejudices and a lot of propaganda you've heard about the people of California, and you're spreading a lot of misinformation about a lot of things here, Dr. Hart.
I've been on the highways, man, here.
Anecdotal.
You're right, right on.
But I'd like to talk about the legalization, decriminalization thing, and also about the example we've seen in places like Portugal and the Netherlands, and whether that's instructive for what we could do here. So, what are you advocating for?
Yeah. So in High Price, I argue that the country
That's
should.
High Price.
High Price, the book. My publicist will be happy.
Available on Amazon.com.
My publicist will be happy. Thank you. One of the things that I argue for in the book is that we decriminalize all drugs, from heroin to methamphetamine to marijuana, all of them. Now, some people say, well, why not legalize? And some people don't know the distinction. Mm-hmm. So legalization would be like what we're doing with alcohol. If you're over 21, you can legally purchase and use the substance without fear of prosecution, and people can sell it legally. Decriminalization, the drugs still remain illegal. However, a criminal penalty is not associated with use. That is, you would get what's equivalent to a traffic violation. Mm-hmm. In Portugal, they've decriminalized all of these drugs, and when people get caught with possessing a certain amount, I think a 10-day supply, they may be required to meet before a board comprised of 3 professionals. Someone maybe in the legal profession, medical profession, the treatment sort of profession. They evaluate the person to see if they need treatment and so forth.
Whereas here we just throw you in jail.
Right. And notice in Portugal, law enforcement is not included in this mix because they have no skills for this particular issue. And so we certainly can look at the Portugal model. They have been decriminalized since 2001. Mm-hmm. And by all of the major indicators, drug use and those sorts of things, they are doing as well or comparable to their European counterparts. And they don't have any plans to change what they're doing. So their model seems to be working for them.
They also don't have prisons that are full of drug users who are then can't get jobs when they come out and are introduced to more hardened criminals who are more involved in crime and so on and so forth, all the other counter problems that we have here in the United States. So I would say they're doing better, but in that regard anyway.
That's right.
And why not legalize? Why decriminalization instead of legalization?
Yeah, I argue that legalization, in this country, we're so ignorant about drugs. And one of my concerns is that if we legalize drugs, they might become more readily available. Now, that may not be such a bad thing. I'm not arguing that you'll see more problems. I'm arguing that more problems will be attributed to the drugs, whether it's true or not, because we're so ignorant. So my argument is that we should have a corresponding increase in education along with this decriminalization. And so decriminalization can serve as an intermediary step. And maybe we will reevaluate and see whether we should legalize everything. I don't know, but what I do know is that we need to increase the education first, along with decriminalization.
You mean you would take a scientific approach? Is that what you do, doctor? You'd actually use science to figure out good public policy? But when you come on the Young Turks and you talk about decriminalizing drugs, nobody says you're crazy, but I'm sure when you talk to more mainstream outlets, they act as though you say that we should move everybody to the moon, or what has something similarly outlandish.
Yeah, one of the things that people who do not support this position say, one of the critiques is that, well, you'll make drugs more available in those poor communities that you care so much about. I find that critique disingenuous Because if people really cared about poor communities, they would understand that in some poor communities, you have as much as 75% of the black males in those communities under criminal justice supervision. And that does so much harm. Those people can't get jobs. The likelihood of them participating in mainstream is so low. And so the folks who give that critique, they should actually go to those communities. They should actually look at the data, the information in those communities, and they will see that the approach that we're taking now has already had far more detrimental effects than this proposal. But they really don't care about those communities, and it's a disingenuous sort of critique.
And you actually have the opposite side of that critique, which is if you look at more affluent communities where drug use is every bit as rampant, although the drugs may be different themselves, but it is essentially decriminalized in many ways, because your odds of being arrested as a middle class, a college student, and white, goes to Bennington College or whatever for smoking marijuana.
Is that the white school, Bennington?
Bennington is I think when I was growing, it was the most expensive college in the country.
Okay.
It's in Vermont.
All right.
And but it's pretty damn white. Okay, St. Olaf College in Minnesota. How's that? But it's virtually nil there, and though it's not devastating these communities. The St. Olaf community is not on the cover of Newsweek, if Newsweek still exists. It's saying what's happening to St. Olaf, And so we have the example of what it means to be virtually decriminalized, and it's not doing that. So I agree with you that these are not people who are genuinely concerned, because they would be already doing something, but it's poverty and so on and so forth. So before we wrap up, I wanted to ask you. You mentioned President Obama and Clinton and George Bush, and how they all were drug users, admitted drug users, and they all managed to somehow make it, beyond that, and not become the
right. This is not to besmirch their reputation. This is to say that you don't need to be perfect in this society in order to make a contribution. Except
when you talk about in your experience, and also definitely with Obama, and less so with Clinton and Bush, but that if you had been unlucky, you were very lucky to get out and not be arrested at any point in time, and not get caught, and not be part of the criminal justice system, because that would have changed your trajectory dramatically. President Obama, the same deal. How do you feel he is doing as someone who understands this, what you're talking about from personal experience, and he must know because he's a living example of it. How do you feel his approach to the drug problem has been, and do you credit him or do you discredit him?
Well, one thing you said that I want to challenge is that I don't think that he must know. I don't think because somebody used drugs they know. That's part of the problem. People use drugs for some limited opportunities, just on some few occasions. And then they think they know about drugs. That's dangerous. Mm-hmm. It's like driving a car. Your only driving experience in a car might be in Wyoming in the dead of the winter when the snow's coming down and you can barely see. If that's your only experience, you say, "Oh, is this so dangerous to drive? You shouldn't drive because you can kill yourself." And so I think a number of these people have that kind of experience as well. So I don't know that he knows.
But we know that he knows that you can take drugs in your youth and still achieve in life later on.
Well, what I do know is just based what he said about drug policy. Mm-hmm. When he was running, he said that, for example, at the time, crack cocaine was treated or punished 100 times more harshly than powder cocaine. He said that he would get rid of that disparity because the scientific evidence says that you should treat them one-to-one. They should be treated equally. Right. And he said he would do that. Of course, it didn't happen, although in August of 2010, the disparity was decreased from 100 to 1 to 18 to 1. And so when I think about President Obama and the current president and his sort of performance with drugs, I don't have much faith in politicians. And I didn't write the book for those people. I wrote the book for the public, because the politicians will move when the public requires them to move. And so I think that people who focus on moving politicians, good luck. I mean, by your actions, like some single person's action, good luck. And that's not even my goal. I don't even really talk about those people. I don't give them that much credit because I don't think that it's up to them.
They're not going to lead on this. They're only going to follow.
They look at polls,
Yeah.
and people who look at polls are misguided because we want leadership, and that's not what we get. We get them looking at polls. What you have here, it's leadership, and that's what I'm trying to do.
Right. We have to create the groundswell, the pressure
That's
on
right.
them based on the science and the truth and what is the actual evidence, and then base policy on the actual evidence. But drug policy is not the only area where that is
That's right.
Shortcoming. But it seems like one of the very important, critical takeaways is to understand that poverty is much more at the root of the so-called drug problem in this country than the drugs. It's not the drugs, it's the poverty.
The poverty and all the awful things that come with it. Unemployment,
Mm-hmm.
lack of skills, lack of plugged into mainstream. All of those awful things that come
Families that are driven apart, and teenage parenthood, and all these things.
all the things that we
They
know.
all existed before the crack epidemic, and crack didn't help.
That's right.
But
It certainly didn't play the major role that people have attributed to it. Hip hoppers have bought into it, filmmakers have bought into it, politicians have bought into it, and they're all wrong.
yeah. Well, you're swimming against the tide, but I wish you the very best of luck. Okay, so thank you very much for watching. The book is High Price, A Neuroscientist's Journey of Self-Discovery that challenges everything you know about drugs and society. It's a mouthful, but it's also an eyeful. When you read it, it's a terrific book, and I want to thank Dr. Carl Hart for coming and speaking with us.
Thank you for
sorry
having
that you had to talk to me, but maybe the next time you come around, you get somebody a little higher up the chain of command.
It's great to have you.
Okay,
Great
thanks
to be
a
here
lot.
with you, man.
And thanks to you for watching.